Here's something that you don't see every day, maybe not ever. A great white shark filmed in the Mediterranean Sea.
90 seconds. That's how long two grown men, trained for years to handle the worst the ocean can throw at them, spent staring at something that supposedly did not exist in these waters anymore. Not a wreck. Not a storm. Not equipment failure. A live adult great white shark, gliding through the blue off the coast of Sicily, as if it had never one seethed possibility that anything beneath the waves might be more dangerous than itself. And in a very real sense, nothing was. This is the story of an encounter that stunned marine biologists not because a shark attacked anyone, but because nothing happened at all, and that nothing turned out to be one of the most important pieces of evidence marine science had seen in decades. To understand why two divers cutting fishing nets off a shipwreck ended up rewriting part of what we know about the Mediterranean, you have to start with the job they actually went down there to do, because it had nothing to do with sharks. The dive took place roughly 50 miles off the Sicilian coast, in the Strait of Sicily, the narrow and historically significant channel that separates Italy from Tunisia and connects the western and eastern halves of the Mediterranean basin. A small team of technical divers descended toward a shipwreck resting around 200 feet down, working with a volunteer organization dedicated to removing what divers call ghost gear, fishing nets and lines that have been lost, abandoned, or simply left behind, and which continue trapping and killing marine life indefinitely, long after any fisherman has stopped thinking about them. At 200 feet, the ocean is a different world entirely. Sunlight loses its warmth and its color as it filters downward. Reds vanish first, then oranges, then yellows, until everything resolves into shades of blue and gray. The pressure at that depth compresses gear, strains the body, and dramatically increases how quickly a diver burns through breathing gas. Every minute spent working at that depth also loads the body with dissolved gas that must be released slowly and carefully on the way back up, through a series of mandatory decompression stops. There is no rushing any of it. A diver at that depth is operating inside a fixed, unforgiving window of time, and the clock does not pause for anything, not fatigue, not equipment trouble, and certainly not surprise. The wreck itself had become exactly what marine researchers describe as an artificial reef, a skeleton of collapsed steel that, over decades, had turned into a magnet for marine life. Small fish sheltered in its gaps. Larger predators patrolled its shadows. And tangled through much of it were sections of abandoned net, the kind that keep functioning long after the boats that lost them have sailed away and forgotten they ever existed. Removing that netting is slow, meticulous, and genuinely dangerous work. It doesn't peel off in sheets. Divers have to work section by section, cutting each strand free from whatever it has fused to over the years, all while rusted metal edges threaten gloves and hoses, and the smallest wrong movement can stir up blinding clouds of silt. It is work that demands total concentration on what's directly in front of you, which meant that, on this particular descent, neither diver was watching the open water behind them. That is precisely why nobody noticed anything until it was already close. According to accounts later given by one of the divers involved, a technical diver and underwater videographer, the change in the water became noticeable a few minutes into the dive. The blue beyond the wreck seemed to shift, the way the air changes just before a storm arrives, and then a shape began to resolve out of the haze. It wasn't fast. It wasn't aggressive. It simply emerged, unhurried, moving with the kind of flat, confident economy of motion that belongs to an animal that has never, in its entire evolutionary history, had reason to worry about what might be hunting it. What came out of that haze was a great white shark, later estimated from the footage to be roughly 13 feet long. And it did not stay at a comfortable, camera-friendly distance. It came close enough that the diver could see its eye track him as it passed. Close enough to watch its gill slits open and close in rhythm with its own forward motion. Close enough to see, in sharp and undeniable detail, the ragged boundary where its gray dorsal coloring broke into a pale underside, the exact visual signature that decades of shark documentaries and horror films have spent building into a symbol of menace. By his own account, the diver's body reacted before his mind caught up. His breathing spiked, which at that depth is not a minor detail. Faster breathing at 200 feet burns through a finite gas supply at an accelerated rate. His hands, he later admitted, were shaking badly enough that he nearly lost hold of his camera entirely. And yet he kept filming, because some instinct beneath the fear recognized that whatever was happening in front of him mattered. What his camera captured over the following minute and a half is, according to people who study this species, almost nothing like what most people expect from an encounter with a great white shark. There was no aggressive posturing, no tightening circles, no arched back or dropped pectoral fins, the kind of body language researchers associate with agitation or a test approach before an attack. The animal did not accelerate. It did not appear to register the divers as a decision it needed to make at all. It simply passed by, unbothered, the way a much larger creature moves through a space it considers unquestionably its own, and then it turned and dissolved back into the deep blue exactly as calmly as it had appeared. Then it was gone. And the two divers were alone again with a bag of cut netting, a dwindling gas supply, and a decompression obligation that had continued accumulating the entire time, indifferent to what had just happened around them. The ascent that followed was its own kind of ordeal. Long, motionless stops at prescribed depths, hanging in open water with nothing to do but wait and think about the fact that the animal that had just examined them at close range was still out there somewhere, unaccounted for, in the same water they were suspended in. When the footage eventually surfaced publicly, it did more than earn views. It is now widely regarded as among the first clear underwater video ever recorded of a living adult great white shark in the Mediterranean Sea. To understand why that claim carries so much weight, you need to understand something almost difficult to believe about this animal and this sea. Nobody was ever really supposed to get to see this. The Mediterranean is, on paper, textbook great white shark habitat, and has been for as long as records exist. This isn't a case of a confused animal wandering somewhere it doesn't belong, the way an occasional whale ends up somewhere far from open ocean and makes headlines for a week. Great whites are supposed to be there. The problem is that almost nobody ever actually sees one, and researchers who study this specific population have openly compared the odds of a genuine, close underwater encounter to winning a lottery. That scarcity has shaped the entire foundation of what scientists know about these animals. Historically, most of the available information about Mediterranean great whites has come not from observing them alive, but from examining them after they were already dead, animals accidentally caught in fishing gear, then studied and catalogued after the fact. It's a bit like trying to understand how an animal lives by only ever examining it on the side of a road. You can measure a body. You cannot observe a behavior from a corpse. Genetic research has added a deeper and stranger layer to the story. A landmark study conducted by researchers affiliated with the University of Bologna, analyzing DNA extracted from historical shark remains and museum specimens collected over roughly 2 centuries, concluded that the Mediterranean's great white population has likely been isolated from every other great white population on the planet for something in the range of 3 million years, a span reaching back into the Pliocene epoch, long before the first stone tools, long before our own genus existed at all. While continents shifted and ice ages came and went, this specific population appears to have spent millions of years quietly circling the same enclosed sea, almost entirely cut off from the rest of its own species. Stranger still, the genetic evidence suggests that Mediterranean great whites are more closely related to great white populations on the far side of the planet, in the Pacific, than to their much closer Atlantic neighbors just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Researchers believe the explanation lies in geography that no longer exists, an ancient sea passage that once connected the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans before the Isthmus of Panama rose and sealed it shut roughly 3.5 million years ago. When that ancient corridor closed, the Atlantic's ecosystem shifted dramatically, and it's believed many species living there died out, possibly including the sharks that had once lived alongside the ancestors of today's Mediterranean population. The Atlantic, researchers suggest, was later repopulated by an entirely separate wave of sharks arriving from elsewhere, leaving the Mediterranean's ancient lineage as a genetically distinct relic, sealed inside its own sea for millions of years. That isolation is a remarkable scientific story. It is also the exact reason this population is now so fragile. A small population that has effectively bred within itself for millions of years carries far less genetic diversity than a large, well-connected one, and low genetic diversity leaves a species with far less built-in resilience against disease, environmental change, or new pressures that arrive faster than evolution can respond to them. Researchers involved in this work have been blunt about what that means. This is likely a small, endangered community, one whose vulnerability runs deeper than raw population numbers alone would suggest, because the fragility is written into the genome itself. Long before anyone understood any of this genetic backstory, people around the Mediterranean were documenting the animal anyway, usually without fully grasping what they were looking at. Records stretch back centuries. Fishermen's accounts, port logs, old paintings and engravings where an unmistakable set of teeth appears in the corner of a scene focused on something else entirely. One particularly striking account, drawn from historical archives, describes an attack on a swimmer near Malaga, Spain, in the summer of 1862, a warm, ordinary day at a busy beach that ended with an incident serious enough to be written down and remembered for more than a century. Locals at the time blamed what they called a morejo. Later analysis strongly suggests it was almost certainly a great white shark. It's a sobering reminder that this animal's presence in these waters isn't new at all. It's ancient, predating every coastal city by an incomprehensible margin. What's new, and genuinely alarming, is how rarely anyone encounters it anymore. The modern numbers make that decline difficult to look away from. Researchers estimate the regional population has dropped by roughly 80% across the last several decades, inside living memory, not some distant geological past. The causes are not mysterious. Decades of overfishing, accidental bycatch in commercial nets, degraded coastal habitat across much of the basin, and outright persecution driven by a fearsome reputation the species never earned and does not deserve. Globally, the International Union for Conservation of Nature lists great white sharks as vulnerable to extinction. The Mediterranean's isolated, genetically distinct subpopulation is assessed far more severely, critically endangered, one step above vulnerable, and one step below gone entirely. Slow reproduction makes recovery even harder. Great white sharks take many years to reach sexual maturity and produce comparatively few offspring across long lifespans, a strategy that works well for an apex predator in a stable ocean, and a serious liability when pressure builds faster than the species can rebuild its own numbers. Even so, rare conformations keep surfacing. In 2018, off the Balearic island of Cabrera near Mallorca, a Spanish marine conservation group documented a great white roughly 16 feet long at the surface in daylight, the first confirmed sighting in Spanish waters in almost 3 decades. More recently, a young great white, small enough to be clearly a juvenile, was accidentally caught in Spanish Mediterranean waters, a discovery that matters enormously because a juvenile implies breeding adults somewhere nearby, continuing quietly out of sight. That incident triggered a fresh wave of historical research, eventually cataloging more than 60 documented occurrences in Spanish waters alone, many clustered curiously around the Balearic Islands, with some researchers pointing to a possible link between shark movements and the migratory patterns of Atlantic bluefin tuna, one of the species' major prey sources. But notice what nearly all of these historical sightings share. They are separated by years, sometimes entire decades, and almost all of them happen at the surface. Almost never does anyone actually see one of these sharks alive, underwater, moving freely through its own environment on its own terms. Which is exactly why what unfolded on that wreck near Sicily became something larger than a lucky story for 2 volunteers to tell over dinner. When the footage reached researchers, the reaction was described as something closer to relief mixed with urgency than simple excitement. Live, high-quality underwater footage offers something a dead specimen pulled from a net simply cannot: a direct window into how the animal actually moves, behaves, and uses its habitat in real time. You can measure a body. You cannot measure behavior from a corpse. The location itself carried scientific weight too. The Strait of Sicily is considered by some researchers to be one of the last true strongholds for this dwindling population, a natural crossroads of currents and migration routes where an animal presumed to be almost gone is apparently still passing through, largely unseen. The diver at the center of the encounter seemed to understand the weight of what had happened almost immediately, comparing the statistical odds of the sighting to winning a jackpot. But scientists were careful to temper the excitement with caution. A single remarkable sighting does not automatically mean the population is recovering. Climate change often redistributes marine life rather than genuinely increasing it. As waters warm and prey shifts range, sharks may simply begin appearing in places or seasons where they were historically less common, without the underlying population actually growing at all. More sightings could mean more sharks. Or it could mean the same small, struggling population is simply becoming easier to stumble across as everything around it rearranges itself. One clip, however extraordinary, cannot settle that question on its own. Part of the difficulty is built into the biology itself. Great white sharks are naturally wide-ranging animals, known elsewhere in the world to migrate staggering distances across entire ocean basins. 4 years that made the idea of a population living quietly and semi-permanently inside the Mediterranean's more enclosed waters seem almost implausible to some scientists. The connection to the wider Atlantic runs through the comparatively narrow bottleneck of the Strait of Gibraltar, a small doorway for an animal capable of crossing oceans. But the genetic evidence has settled that question. This is a distinct, largely self-contained population, one that adapted over millions of years to a smaller range than its more far-ranging relatives elsewhere, and that same isolation is exactly what makes it so vulnerable now. A population confined largely to one relatively small, heavily fished, heavily trafficked sea cannot simply swim away from human pressure into some untouched corner of the ocean. Every abandoned net, every degraded stretch of coastline, every disruption to the region's food web lands directly on this one ancient, irreplaceable group of animals. They cannot leave. That is the whole problem. There is also a quieter complication worth understanding, because it affects how confident researchers can be in any given historical record. Juvenile great whites in the region are sometimes mistaken for another critically endangered species found in the same waters, the shortfin mako shark, and the confusion runs in both directions. Makos misidentified as white sharks, and young white sharks misidentified as makos. That's part of what makes clear, confirmed footage so valuable. It removes all ambiguity. There is no interpretation required in the Sicily footage. It is, unambiguously, an adult great white shark filmed alive at depth in a sea where that had never been documented on video before. The contrast between the reputation and the reality on display in that footage matters more than it might seem at first. Public fear has measurable consequences for an endangered animal. Fear makes political protection difficult, because no one builds a conservation campaign around a monster. Fear shapes what a fisherman does when something enormous comes up alive in a net with nobody watching. Fear turns what should be a moment of caution and release into a trophy instead of a quiet act of mercy. Correcting decades of exaggerated menace around this species isn't a sentimental afterthought, it's a practical piece of the conservation puzzle. So where does that leave things? The underlying science remains sobering. This is still among the most endangered shark populations documented anywhere on the planet, worn down by decades of overfishing, habitat loss, and accidental capture, compounded by millions of years of genetic isolation that left it with dangerously little diversity to draw on. Best estimates still suggest a population that has collapsed dramatically compared to where it likely stood even a century ago. And yet this footage, however brief and however improbable, stands as a genuine data point of hope. It proves that at least some of these animals are still out there, still healthy enough to reach an impressive adult size, still moving calmly through historic strongholds exactly as their ancestors likely have for millions of years. For researchers, encounters like this one function as precious, hard-won pieces in an otherwise mostly incomplete picture. They still cannot say with confidence how far individual Mediterranean sharks typically range within the sea. They cannot say where the species' critical nursery areas are located, arguably the single most important unanswered question for its long-term survival, since nothing can protect a nursery that has never been found. And they cannot say how much genetic exchange, if any, still occurs with sharks beyond Gibraltar. Every confirmed sighting adds one more small piece to that unfinished understanding. Perhaps the most quietly powerful part of this story is how ordinary its origin was. This wasn't a well-funded expedition built around the goal of finding a shark. There was no cage, no bait, no spotter boat, no research budget written for it. It was captured by volunteers doing unglamorous, physically demanding cleanup work, freeing a forgotten wreck from decades of tangled fishing lines simply to leave one small patch of ocean a little healthier than they found it. The shark appeared almost as an unplanned reward for that quiet, unseen effort, and that detail says something true about how conservation actually functions. Not through single dramatic interventions, but through accumulated small acts of repair that keep the door open for extraordinary moments to happen at all. Somewhere off the coast of Sicily right now, in the blue water beyond a forgotten shipwreck, there is very likely a shark still moving through the Mediterranean the way its ancestors have for roughly 3 million years. Mostly unseen, mostly unknown, quietly surviving in a sea that has, within the span of a single human century, pushed its ancient lineage to the edge of extinction. For 90 seconds, one trembling diver with a camera caught a glimpse of that long, silent survival, and for the first time, the rest of the world got to see it too. It leaves behind a question worth sitting with long after the footage ends. How much else is still moving quietly through waters we assume we already understand, waiting for someone, purely by accident, to finally look?